This is a long day, long in coming. My involvement started almost 15 years ago. I had a group of Japanese tourists coming through the museum who were interested in civil rights in America. And they were going to places throughout America where civil rights events had occurred. And they wanted to come to DeSoto County to see where James Meredith had been shot. They came to the museum, I gave them a tour through, and the best I could do was to tell them, well, turn at the courthouse, go down the road till you see a big tank, and it's just a little bit further. There was no marker. There's nothing at that time to mark this important place. And that day I decided that, we needed to have a historic marker. And we started our dialogue with the state, working at coming up with ideas of a state marker. And about that same time, they started the ideas of having a civil rights trail throughout the state. And we said, well, let's make it part of that. And that's why we're here today. A conversation that 15 years ago led to this. Going back a little further, to give you an idea of what happened here in 1966, was Mr. Meredith's walk through Mississippi. He told me several years ago that it wasn't a march, it was a walk, one man's walk. He had already integrated Ole Miss, he had integrated the United States Air Force, and now he had turned his attention to allowing people to have the simple right to vote in the state of Mississippi. Jim Crow laws that had been enacted for so much of the 20th century had barred African Americans from voting throughout the state. And he wanted to show to the world that a black man could walk through the state of Mississippi and encourage African Americans to vote along the way. He started in Memphis on June 5th, 1966, left the city of Memphis traveling down Highway 51, got to the state line and spent the night there. Got up the next morning and continued his trek down the highway through DeSoto County. It was a very, very hot afternoon of June 6th. If you can remember those days in June, it's a lot hotter than this, and that heat had something to do with some of the events of that day. The sheriff's department escorted him through the county. We had one sheriff and one deputy in those days, and they got him around the square and started south of the square out of the county, and the sheriff sighed a sigh of relief that nothing had happened to Mr. Meredith while he was through DeSoto County, because he was on his way to Tate County and out of their responsibility. Meanwhile, the photographer, who was 26 years old, named Jack Thornell, was walking with Mr. Meredith and jumped in a car and gotten a little bit ahead of him, and it was extremely hot, and decided to pull off and grab a Coke at the local little gas station there on the side of the road, because he knew that was the last gas station before they got to the big town of Coldwater. And so he pulled over to the side of the road drinking that ice-cold Coke and waited for Mr. Meredith to catch back up with him. And that's when the events took an ominous turn for the day. As James came by him, Jack Thornell got out of the car, grabbed his camera, and just as that moment, he heard a man scream out, James Meredith, I want you." And as Mr. Meredith turned to look at the man that had called out his name, the man pointed a 16-gauge shotgun at him across the highway and shot 3 times. Those bullets peppered his chest, and he fell to the ground wounded. The photographer snapped pictures as it was happening. For the first time in American history, we had a photograph of the assailant actually committing the assault on a national hero. The photographer took 2 rolls of film that day. One of those was as James Meredith fell to the ground bleeding, trying to duck the bullets. That photograph hangs in our museum and other museums throughout the world because it's one of the most iconic images of the civil rights movement. In 1967, that photograph won the Pulitzer Prize for photography. Many folks say the anguish that you can see in James Meredith's face as he's been shot falling to the ground summarizes the anguish of the entire African American population during those times. As James Meredith lay there wounded, bleeding on the side of the highway, the man who had shot him stood up, put the gun down, and just waited to be arrested. The sheriff came running back up to the scene, grabbed the man by the arm, he did not resist, and was put in a patrol car and taken back to Hernando to jail. As James Meredith lay there wounded, the call went to Hernando that he had been shot. In those days, we didn't have an ambulance service. You had to call the funeral home, and they sent the hearse to take you to the hospital. And that caused some confusion, because as the hearse pulled up, a lot of the media thought he had been killed, and they went out on the AP wires that James Meredith had been killed in Hernando, Mississippi. Luckily, he was only wounded. The ambulance took him to Memphis to the hospital, where they were able to save his life, and he waited there and recuperated. The man who shot him was escorted to jail, pled guilty, and served 18 months of a 5-year sentence for attempted murder of this man. Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders came to that hospital room that night and stood around the bed of James Meredith and decided that they would not allow this walk through Mississippi to end with this tragedy. They decided to continue that march the very next day. Dr. King, Stokely Carmichael, and other civil rights leaders came right back to this spot and restarted his walk. It took them another 3 weeks to get to Jackson. By that point, James Meredith was able to get out of the hospital and to meet him, as well as 12,000 other folks that had joined that march down Highway 51. They stood on the steps of the old Capitol and encouraged African Americans to exercise their rights to vote. That became the largest civil rights demonstration in the state's history, and all because of the events that occurred right here in DeSoto County. I got to first meet James Meredith in 1996, when for the very first time since those days, on the exact 30th anniversary, he came back to DeSoto County to re-walk those steps where he had been shot 30 years earlier. He started at the court square and came right back to this place to show the difference in 30 years. In those 30 years, a lot of things had changed. And one of the most obvious signs to me as a young man who got to walk with him was that he was escorted by an African-American deputy down the center of the highway. They stopped all the traffic for him, where in 1966 he was not allowed to walk on the pavement. In 2014, he came back for the second time. We got to meet him again. Came for a book signing at the Hernando Library. And then last year, Rob Long and I, he was our next speaker, got to meet him and spend a couple of weeks with him out west in Idaho and Washington, traveling to different universities, telling the story of James Meredith and his integration of Ole Miss and the tragedies that struck him here in DeSoto County. But we didn't leave it there. We brought it up to what has happened in all those 40, 50 years now that have changed. A lot of things have changed in those 50 years. I think Mr. Meredith sums it up best in his book, and I like to quote him on this. He says, "In spite of it all, I have learned that, as my father said, these people can be decent. The people who wanted me dead in 62 and those who rebuked me in 1966 have transformed into a different people. Or maybe they have found something in themselves that they did not know that was there before. Today we stand here a changed people, not one rebuking him, not one that is spitting on him, not one that is trying to shoot him, but one who is here to honor him." Thank you.